Hello, everyone. My name is Supriya, and I'm going to be talking a little bit about the Zabbaleen population today, and they can be found in the Mokattam region of Cairo, Egypt. So, a little bit about the purpose of this presentation. I'm going to be talking about the health differences between the Zabbaleens population in comparison to the general population of Cairo. And I'm going to be talking a little bit about the environmental hazards as well as the health related precautions that the Zabbaleens take as a result of their jobs. And then I'm going to be talking a bit about the specific morbidities that occur within the Zabaleen population as a result of their job and their exposure to certain pieces of waste. And then I'm going to note some of the rates that disproportionately affect the Zabaleen people, in particular that of hepatitis C. So the flow of this presentation will be, I'm going to give a little bit of an overview of who the Zabaleen people are, and then I'm going to talk about some of the health hazards they encounter as a result of their job, some of the personal hygiene that they undertake as a result of their job as well, their health hazards and how they biologically manifest within this population, the infant mortality rates amongst the Zabaleen in comparison to that of Cairo, and then a little note about hepatitis C and the rate in Egypt and why it disproportionately affects the Zabaleen population. So, a little bit about who the Zabaleen people are. Zabaleen in Arabic means garbage people. And essentially, the Zabaleen population has kind of segregated themselves in this Mokattam village, which is a subset of the city of Cairo. And the Zabaleens are responsible for picking up and effectively disposing of all of Cairo's trash. And as you can imagine, Cairo is a very large city, and the amount of waste that is produced by a city of that size is quite large. So, this population is responsible for clearing it, and unfortunately, a lot of it gets stored in this village, which is why it's been unfortunately nicknamed Garbage City. So, some of the health hazards that this population encounter as a result of clearing waste, a lot of this waste is comprised of animal waste, used needles, broken glass, hospital waste. So, as you can imagine, for this population, they are exposed to a wide array of physical, biological, and chemical contaminants. And not only can they produce physical harm, but they can also really affect their health moving forward as a result of inhalation or physical exposure. And then, in terms of some of the preventative measures that this population takes, as you can see here, not everyone is following basic hand hygiene when it comes to their day to day life. So, this graph shows the frequency of hand washing amongst the population after certain activities. So, as we know, basic personal hygiene is essential for reducing the risks of ill health from handling waste. But as we can see, not everyone in this population are taking those precautions. Similarly, we can also see the use of protective equipment is not always being followed. I will note that the Zabaleen population is known for its low socioeconomic status, so things like gloves and face masks or goggles might not always be available to them financially or just availability wise. But if I were a Zabaleen, I know I would want protective equipment like masks and gloves and goggles to protect myself against those biological and physical contaminants. But again, as we can see here, that's not always the case amongst this population. And then, in terms of how their exposure to this waste affects them biologically, we can see that a large portion of the population reports signs and symptoms such as diarrhea, vomiting, cough, headache, fatigue. And although these are symptoms and signs that might only affect their health in the short term, chronic exposure to this trash actually can produce long term health effects such as lung cancer, forms of GI cancer, and can also really damage their reproductive tracts moving forward as well. And that's something I'm going to be touching on the next slide. So, like I mentioned, exposure to waste long term can have reproductive outcomes. And in particular, we can see here that infant mortality rates amongst the Zabbaleen peoples in comparison to the general population of Egypt during the same time frame was nearly triple. So 117 per thousand you can see in the Zabbaleen population compared to about 46 per thousand in the general Cairo population in the early 1900s. Another thing that disproportionately affects the Zabbaleens population is hepatitis C. I will note that hepatitis C in general has its greatest prevalence in Egypt, and unfortunately, this is due to a failed mass vaccination campaign which happened in the early 1990s. And as a result of this failed vaccination campaign, there were bottles and syringes that were not properly sanitized between uses, leading to an HCV epidemic. And because it's the Zabbaleen people who are responsible for collecting the trash from local hospitals and clinics, they were disproportionately exposed to the harmful biohazards and toxins that were present in this waste, in particular needles. And if we go back to one of my previous slides about types of waste that the Zabbaleen encounter, you'll notice that used needles was one of the most reported things that they encountered. So, unfortunately, one of the most common diseases found amongst the Zabbaleen population is the blood-borne version of hepatitis C. So, as we can see through this presentation, the Zabbaleen people have encountered a wide array of biological, physical, and chemical toxins as a result of their line of work. And although some of the population takes precautions in preventing their exposure, it's unfortunately not something that all can partake in given their low socioeconomic status. And although the signs and symptoms that they report can have short term effects, it can also have long term effects in their GI, respiratory, and reproductive tracts. And unfortunately, the infant mortality rates amongst this population are much higher than the general population of Cairo. And this is likely due to the exposure to harmful chemicals in the trash that they are collecting. And then lastly, we talked a little bit about hepatitis C and why this community is disproportionately affected by it. And here you can see my works cited page. I had about 5 significant sources, one of which is where I pulled the 2 graphs that I did not create from. Okay, thank you so much for listening. I hope you all have a wonderful day.